Hey, hi everyone. I see there's still some people trickling in, but in the meantime, I thought I'd introduce myself and the webinar series and then our speaker. So I'm Dr. Sarah Jandrisic. I'm the Greenhouse Floriculture IPM specialist with OMAFRA. This is one of our ongoing GrowON webinars in our series, basically designed to bring the latest IPM information and production information to growers as soon as we get it. So this is an exciting talk from one of our own. Dr. Jason DeVoe has been our sprayer application technology specialist. I'm probably butchering that, since around 2008, I think is right, or 2010, Jason? A long time.
2008.
2008, okay. And he's got several degrees in plant stuff, plant physiology, and then plant cell electrophysiology, which I don't even know what that is. But he has somehow combined these skills into parlaying this into some interesting engineering skills to work on sprayer technology. And his goals are really to optimize spraying for growers and reduce waste. So a little bit of housekeeping. Sorry, my video is lagged, but really only Jason needs to look good today. We want you to put, if you've got technology issues, put that in the chat, or just comments like, Jason, you're so awesome, put that in the chat. But if Jesus laughing, but questions and answers, if you could put them in the Q&A function, that would be great. We're going to moderate the questions there. And then at the end of Jason's talk, throw him some hardballs, I hope. So with no further ado, we're going to introduce Jason and let him share his screen and take over.
Cool. Thank you both. And I parlayed plant physics into this through black magic and blackmail. Just in case you're curious and anyone wants a career path, pictures from Christmas parties can get you a long way. Let me know when you can see my screen share. How's that looking?
Looks good, Jason.
Alrighty, let's get rolling. So yes, I'm the application technology specialist with OMAFRA, and in English, that means I spray things, all kinds of things. And over the last 15 years, I've done application in pretty much every crop Ontario's got, even some that it doesn't. So that could be everything from wheat to apple trees to soybeans to greenhouses. And greenhouses represent a unique usage pattern that kind of require all kinds of application technology talks on their own. But for today, I'm going to step back and be a smidge more generic, even though I recognize that this is closed environment talks and maybe even some nursery growers. I want to kind of rip back the curtain and show you how fungicides are registered, what sort of information is required to get them from molecule to market, and what happens when they get into your hands, assuming you're the applicator. Because there are a lot of disconnects and variables along the way that can add up to making or breaking your application. And if you're informed about all the things that matter and all the things that maybe don't matter, it can help you make the right moves to improve your own operation. So, lots of big words here, but basically, I just want to show you how the sausage is made. Let's see if I can forward a slide. Yay, okay. Before I can have a good conversation with you, I think we should all be speaking the same language. And there are, believe it or not, a few different ways to interpret some of these foundational concepts. The first is dose. Now, the way I talk about dose, I'm talking about how much of the active product or active ingredient landed on your target. That could be a leaf, a flower, a bud, whatever. And a way to describe that might be micrograms of product per square centimeter. That's for like a surface deposit, not a drench, but maybe like a foliar application. Some people don't think of dose that way. They think of dose as how much product is applied per planted area. Those people are wrong. This is far more applicable to so many different crop physiologies and so many different use patterns. So I prefer to kind of zoom down to the target's point of view. Coverage. We all hear that good coverage is important, but I defy people to define it. It's tricky. I define coverage as kind of two things at the same time. It's the spread of deposits across the surface, and that is not only how much the surface got covered, but how those deposits are distributed over the target. It kind of matters not only that it landed, but where it landed. I think you can appreciate that, and we'll dig into that a little later. And finally, efficacy. And I guess the quick and dirty way to define efficacy is, did it work the way it was advertised? But I've got to use more words in a formal definition. So I'm going to say that efficacy is product specific. Whether it worked or not is a scale of how it was intended to work. And for it to work as advertised, you got to get enough there and get it in the right place. So pretty fundamental stuff. Two more definitions and then we can get rolling. What is a dilute volume? Maybe you've heard this term before, maybe you haven't, but dilute volume, as far as I'm concerned, there we go, is when the outer portion of a plant canopy begins to drip. Like you've sprayed to the point where it simply can't hold anymore. And the inner portion of the canopy gets reasonable coverage, whatever that happens to be. Now, a dilute volume isn't an absolute value. It really depends on what you're trying to spray and how you're spraying it. It's a function of how much surface area is on that plant. If it's got 2 leaves, that's not a lot of surface area, unless they're banana leaves. If it's a massive oak tree, that's a lot of surface area. And maybe you're not a good shot. For that drip to occur, you have to kind of get it all there. Maybe you're a bad shot and half of it missed. And ultimately, dilute volume, whatever it happens to be, is what registrants, the people who sell your chemistries, it's what registrants use to define how much is needed per planted area. So that's a lot of information just then. This is a pretty critical topic. So I hope you understood that. Whereas a concentrate volume is not a dilute volume. In a concentrated volume, you don't get to run off. You don't spray so much liquid that it runs off the surface. But you do want the same amount of product. And that means you have to concentrate it. If I've got a liter of water and I put an ounce of product in it to mix units, maybe I don't want that dilute volume. I want a concentrated volume, so I only use a quarter of a liter. But I'm still going to put that ounce of product in. So that's the difference between dilute and concentrate, how much water you've used when you spray. Okay, good. All that housekeeping is done. Now here's the claim on which everything is based. Assuming your timing requirements are satisfied, like you sprayed at the right time, and assuming you do a good job, have the right product, used your IPM, if you do better jobs at coverage, you're going to get better crop protection. Like, that's what we've all been told. More coverage is better crop protection. Not always. Not always. The reason we use coverage as an indicator for performance is that coverage is really important for fungicides. They're kind of the hardest ones to use. And why are fungicides the hardest to use? Lots of reasons. Most of them are non-volatile. That is, once they hit, they stay. They don't volatilize, which is become an airborne product. They're sessile, they land, that's where they work. They don't tend to translocate or redistribute. Some do, most don't. And by that, I mean they don't pass through the leaf. They don't enter the leaf's apoplasm or vascularity in any way. If you spray a leaf, you won't find this product in the root. There are exceptions, but most of them are contact-based products. And that means they don't have a very big effective radial distance. What does that mean? The distance from the deposit, you just go a little ways beyond where it landed, it's not going to do you any good. If you didn't hit it, you missed. Further to that, they have to contact pretty tiny and relatively non-moving pests as a rule. If you're spraying a fungicide, maybe that spore has to hit a spot where a deposit or a residue lives, or maybe you have to spray it directly, but it's not like they're running around and they're going to come across a deposit. If that deposit's not there when the spore lands, it's not going to work. And as products change over time, we have access to less and less broad-acting products, so fewer shotguns and more sniper rifles. And even then, those products, they aren't knockdown products with a kickback. They maybe suppress at best. And that means if you did everything right, I mean, if you followed the letter of the law and you had a perfect application, you would still only truly control 60 to 70% of the pest. So, that's why I said when we discuss efficacy, it kind of depends on the product we're using. 60% control is efficacious for some fungicides. Now, how are they applied? Well, the application methods that are used to test new fungicides, new molecules, and to generate the data that eventually ends up on your pesticide labels can be really, really different from what you do as an end user. And this is especially important in horticultural crops. Now, in this case, I love this picture. This is an actual um, application, a test application in corn. Do you think this is how growers apply products in corn? The answer is no, of course. But the assumption with doing this way is whatever data this individual generates, that's what's going on the label to direct an end user to do their job. And you start to question, are we comparing apples to oranges? What is the relevance of what this individual is doing versus what you as an end user might use? Ultimately, these disconnects affect pesticide value. What do I mean by that? I mean, maybe it won't work. That's compromised efficacy. Maybe if you get sublethal doses in the same place often enough, you increase the risk of pest resistance. Maybe you end up with variable residue levels. So if you're selling a good that someone's going to eat and they're testing residue levels, if they test in the wrong place, they could have an unduly high level versus maybe not very much. Overall, not putting product on correctly is a waste of resources. That's time, product, energy. And if you sprayed and it didn't actually work, that's an unnecessary environmental load. It didn't need to be there, especially if you spray and it doesn't work and you've got to go back in. That's two applications where one better application might have sufficed. So there are lots of reasons for trying to dial in an application and get it as close to what the registrant intended as possible. So some of you, maybe people that are registrants listening, might think I'm trying to make a mountain out of a molehill here. And, that's fair. Not every research study that tests products is using a method that's completely different from what an applicator would use. I would challenge that in horticultural systems, but in field crops, generally speaking, they're pretty close. Let's talk about some of the variables that may differ. To do that, I'd like to just give you a summary of how a product is registered. And I went through a lot of registrants before I'm comfortable with this. So when a molecule is discovered to when it's commercialized, that is in your hands, could be 12 to 14 years. It is a long run from, hey, look what this does, to it being in a jug in your operation. First, there's core discovery. Somebody found a molecule that did something. And then the registrant or some testing service will look at a lot of variations on this molecule. These are analogs. And they're going to look for how well they work. They're going to look to see if they're toxic. They're going to look to see how long the residue sticks around. And, depending on where this work is performed, it could be in greenhouses. It could be in labs. We're not out in the real world yet. And then we have to look at formulation. So, you don't just get a molecule in an envelope. It's in a jug of other stuff. Those are inerts and suspension agents, adjuvants, things to keep the product shelf stable and to help it hydrate when you put it in your tank and spread out. Maybe it's got to work with other tank mixes. Basically, how well does this molecule play in the jug with other products? From that point, the registrant or their testing service finally gets out into the real outdoors and starts doing small plot efficacy trials. And they're generally looking at residue here. And this could take place on a research farm or again in greenhouses. And for the most part, they test rates that are exactly what they intend, half of what they intend, twice of what they intend, an untreated control, and then some other product that's already registered that maybe does the same thing, just to see how it stacks up against unknown. Finally, all that data is submitted to the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, and hopefully they're issued a field research authorization. And that's where trusted grower cooperators get their hands on some of these prototypical products, and they're left to use it for a few seasons, under supervision, of course. And this is where the registrant wants to see really how good the fit is between everything they did and what a grower might do. And this is a really important step given to what we're talking about. But you know what? Most of these trusted grower cooperators are kind of the creme de la creme. The reason they're trusted grower cooperators is they represent the highest echelon of applicator. So they kind of don't represent average use. And finally, after all of this, the label is written, which is pretty complicated if there are things in that jug that don't belong to the original registrant, and the PMRA approves it, and the product gets commercialized and falls into the hands of sales and marketing, who will knock on your door with color brochures. And that's kind of how a bill becomes a law. Now, what in that process could possibly be any different through testing than what you might do? Here are the biggies: spray quality, which is droplet size; target variability, which is what is it you're trying to shoot at; the definition of what good coverage is; and finally, how you spray. Those, those have a wide latitude of variability. So let's dig in. Spray quality. When I talk about spray quality, I mean the average droplet size. That's not really correct, but it's a good way to think about it. Uh, we have standards out there that different nozzles and different pressures and different apparatus can make droplets of a certain size. So when someone says that droplet's fine, they're not commenting on its outfit. They mean that the average droplet diameter is about 150 microns. And again, this isn't really true, but it's a white lie I tell to get this point across. Whereas if you're using a very coarse droplet, that could be 350 microns in diameter. The point is, droplets of many different sizes are capable of doing very different things. And generally, you don't see any of that information on a label. Now, depending on the operation we're talking about, certain droplet sizes tend to be used in certain operations. In closed environments, we tend towards finer droplets. And honestly, there could be an argument made that, yeah, you guys are using really coarse droplets too. But the point is, there's a whole spectrum of droplet sizes I might find in a greenhouse. If you're using some sort of fogger in the corner and you shut the door on a Quonset hut before you leave, those are extremely fine droplets. That is quite literally fog. And they're going to behave wildly differently than if someone's walking along with a boom and spraying coarse droplets. So in closed environments, I would expect to see a whole range of droplet sizes. What kind of guidance are you getting about which one's best? For interest in perennial three-dimensional crops like apple, grape, that kind of thing, they tend to lean towards finer droplets too, maybe a medium fine. And in field and row crops, they could go from medium coarse, or if they're spraying dicamba, all the way up to extremely and ultra coarse. And this all matters. Look at it from the perspective of potential coverage. Here is a leaf, a poorly drawn one. I did my best. And I've broken it up into quadrants. In the top left, that is a single 400 micron droplet. Call it very to extremely coarse. And if it were to land, it would cover 125,000 square microns of area. That same volume in the top right could be achieved with 8 200 micron droplets. But even though the volume of liquid is the same, look at how much more area it can cover, twice as much. Bottom left, that same volume. That's not true. Those are 100 micron droplets in diameter. I apologize. All of these are the same volume. I should have said that. But the diameter of the droplet is what's changing. And the more droplets you get, potentially the higher the area. And that's because volume and droplet size share a cubic relationship. What you're seeing is hypothetical. I mean, it's assuming every single drop's going to hit. It assumes that one droplet doesn't land on another, and it assumes that they all stick when they arrive. But the point is made that the more droplets you have, as they get smaller and smaller, the greater potential coverage you have, even though the volume remained the same. That's a big difference, just strictly based on droplet size. From a pest's perspective, here's what it might look like. This is a mullein bug on the left. This is all to scale. If you ever see a mullein bug actually this big run screaming, it's actually 2,500 microns long. If we sprayed 250 liters per hectare and we used 200 micron droplets, we would have the potential to land 6 drops per square millimeter. And to a mullein bug, it would look like this. Good luck, mullein bug. You're just not getting away. With an ascospore, tripping on my tongue, which we have in the top right here, with its germ tube, maybe it's about 15 microns long, considerably smaller. So let's take that same 250 liters and break it up into smaller pieces. With 50 micron droplets of fog, you could land 400 drops per millimeter squared, unlike 6 drops on the left. And to an ascospore, this is what it looks like. It just fills its whole world. So droplet size is a way to take a set amount of liquid and of active ingredient and maybe distribute it differently over the target. Now, not only is there potential to do that for the sake of coverage, also we have to consider how those droplets behave once they've been created. This is an ugly table. I won't apologize for it. It's just an ugly table. But what it's meant to show is how droplets of different sizes might move once they've been created. In green, you see droplets under 50 microns. Those are the fogs. So that's 5 microns, 10, and 40 in the left-hand column. And you could see that if I took a 5-micron droplet and somehow pinched it between my fingers and dropped it from a 3-meter height, it would take over 4,000 seconds to fall because it's so tiny. It's got no momentum and no mass. Gravity doesn't even care about it. So that's how long it takes to fall. And while it's falling over 4,000 seconds, maybe there's a light wind, a 5-kilometer-an-hour crosswind. That has the potential to make it drift sideways over 5.5 kilometers. That's amazing because it's in the air so long and can be influenced so easily. But if you were to make those, you'd end up with 150,000 of them if you took 1 liter and broke it up that small. Now, as droplets get bigger and bigger and bigger, let's go over to the 400 microns in the left-hand column. That's like light rain. That falls in less than 2 seconds because it's got more mass and more momentum. And if you had a 5-kilometer wind, it would knock it about 2.5 meters to one side. Not bad, not bad at all. But you'd only end up with about 0.3 drops per square centimeter if you did a liter. So my point here is not, to run screaming towards tiny, tiny droplets because of their potential for coverage, but to recognize their survivability and how they behave in the real world means that while there's great coverage potential for tiny drops, there's also great potential to have them evaporate or blow off course. Here's a video from Syngenta. These are very coarse droplets, and they move very quickly, and they move generally in straight lines because air doesn't tend to deflect them, and they have a high velocity. If we go to a finer spray, such as this droplet, or this nozzle here, you can see how they move very slowly. And for interest's sake, on the outer edges of this flat fan pattern, you can see they're coarser droplets than in the middle. That's what every flat fan does. Coarser towards the outside, fewer droplets because they're bigger, and actually less volume on the outer edges too, because in cross-section, they're sort of teardrop shaped on either side, or bird mouth. So recognizing how droplets behave and what your nozzles do may help you better understand what they can and can't do when you get them into the greenhouse. Now, I mentioned earlier, breaking up spray into smaller droplets potentially can improve coverage, but they do other wacky things. A 600 micron droplet won't drift because it's like dropping a brick, but it'll bounce. If you hit a waxy leaf or hit it at the wrong angle, even though you hit your target, it may not get retained. It just ricochets right off. A 350 micron droplet, that would be medium coarse, there's still some rebound. There may be a little drift, but not much. The 200 micron droplet, that would be a fine to fine medium, a little more drift there, but they don't generally bounce. And then, with mist or 100 micron droplets, killer coverage if they get there, but they may blow away before they arrive or even evaporate. They sure won't bounce, but who knows how many get to their target. So let's talk about the target. Target variability, or plant surface wettability is another way to think of it. What you're trying to spray matters. Different plant surfaces have varying wettability. Some will retain spray more readily than others. In the case of grape, it's 3 or 4 times harder to spray the fruit because it's waxy and because it's vertical, things will tend to drip off. But the leaves, with all their reticulate little wrinkles and structure, and the fact that they're fairly laminar, that is flat and maybe laying face straight up, they're far easier to hit. This is kale and clay, just sort of an inert. And you can see here the same spray application, how much better it's stuck to the leaves and how poor it's stuck to the fruit. So we're starting to recognize the difference in droplet size, behavior, and how it interacts with the crop. You may not see this on a label, just want to bring it home. Here's a nice waxy leaf hit by a really big droplet, and this is so cool. The big droplet shatters. You get initial coverage, which is where it landed, and maybe you get secondary coverage where it shatters and bounces and goes to different places. This might be something you want. Or if that leaf were sideways, it'd run right off, and it's something you don't want. So starting to recognize this relationship can help you make better choices. Crops that have trichomes, those are the fuzzy little hairs on, I don't know, tomatoes or sunflowers or other crops with those hairs. If the droplet's too small, it can get caught up on those trichomes. It's good for retention, but I've seen slow motion video of the droplets getting caught way up high on these. And if an insect or a disease is on the leaf surface, it'll never reach it. It just evaporates right where it landed, caught up on these hairs. In this case, using a spreader might be a good idea. Breaks down the cohesion of the droplet. Its viscosity changes. It gets thinner, so it's more likely to shatter and run down the surface of the plant. Which brings us to another way that you might improve coverage. We talked about mechanical spread, that's more droplets, but chemical spread is a tool in your pocket that may help improve the degree of contact between spray and target. Just an interesting little thing here. If you decide and you are permitted to use an adjuvant in your products, or perhaps the label asks for it, and you decide you're going to use water-sensitive paper to look at your coverage. And for those who aren't in the know, water-sensitive paper changes from yellow to blue when it's contacted by liquid. So it's a really nice way to get a quick feedback on the job that you're doing. Well, when you use something like a super spreader, as Robin Gaskin did here, and apply just a ton of it, it doesn't seem to affect the area or the spread on water-sensitive paper. We went from 2 millimeters squared up to 4, even though we put a lot of spreader in it. But look at those droplets on an actual plant surface. A huge difference. So I'm just telling you that if you do want to ever look at an adjuvant and figure out what it's doing for your coverage, water-sensitive paper will always be a worst-case scenario. The only real way to figure out what adjuvants are doing as far as spread is to look at the actual surface of the plant itself. So it would be great to see something like this on a pesticide label, particularly when it asks for a spreader, but you don't. Speaking of spread, droplet size also affects spread. The bigger the droplet, the further it's going to spread. Just imagine dropping a water balloon on the ground. It's going to spread. The smaller the droplet, the less spread, all the way down to where you have 100 microns, where they pretty much stay the size they were when they hit. In fact, they may sit on the surface like a bowling ball sitting on the floor. Very little contact. So if you do decide to use an adjuvant, look at what's possible. On the left is a concentrated application, and we know from our earlier discussions that means you didn't use a lot of water. On the right is the dilute application. In other words, we used a lot of water. But those images don't look the way your gut says they should. It's because of this adjuvant, this super spreader. In the case of the concentrate on the left, if there is video for this, when you see it hit, it just creeps eerily all along the surface and actually wraps around to the bottom of the leaf and starts creeping along the bottom. So different products that you buy may already have different adjuvants in the jug. And you have really no way of knowing what they're going to do unless you look on the crop itself. Unfortunately, for those of you who are going to run out and buy a bunch of super spreaders, they also can cause phytotoxicity, and they definitely increase the degree of runoff. You don't need as much water before it just runs off the plant. So runoff itself as an indicator for label rates is kind of a dumb move, because depending on how you applied it, I could make a crop run using 30% more or less water just by changing droplet size and depending on what part of the plant I'm looking at. So if there's a 60% variability in how much liquid it takes to start runoff, not a great metric for determining rates if that's your only reason or your only metric for doing that. Finer spray is less likely to run. I think we established that. And bigger spray is more likely to run. And where it tends to collect, maybe at the bottom of fruit, as that last little drop doesn't fall off, it just dries in place, or in depressions in the crop. If you're doing residue wipes at the bottom of fruit, you're going to find higher rates than if you looked at the top. At runoff, at that point where the first droplet falls off, if you see one drop fall off, you can assume 15% of the dose you applied was lost. There's math to prove that. We don't generally want to incur runoff. Unless the product is intended as a drench, it's usually an indication of waste. So where do you look on your plant to figure out if you've got good coverage? Part of understanding what goes on behind the curtain is appreciating canopy indexing. Here's an air blast sprayer and for some reason a Christmas tree. And if you look at different portions of this tree as the sprayer drives past, here is a fairly generic likelihood of how much dose or how much product you can expect to find. At the bottom right, absolute closest to the sprayer, you would find 3 times as much as, say, just further in to the left. There's 1x and 3x. That's because the tree just sort of selectively filters out the spray. It all slammed into the outside, and those spray droplets don't go any further. So it just sort of builds up there. If you look at the very top left, at less than 0.1x compared, to some index 1x, you can see why it's so important to get your spray as close to the target as possible and to recognize how poor or how difficult it is to get spray to penetrate a dense canopy. It's why if we were air blast applicators here today, I would be telling everyone to spray both sides of this tree, not just one. But for anyone thinking about their crops and how dense they are and where that nozzle is positioned relative to the canopy, this is a fairly classic relationship between distance and canopy density. So something to keep in mind. I'm not going to bore you with that. I'm already going on too long. Target variability. One label registered for 14 different crops has one rate, maybe, or one water volume, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe I'm being unfair there. There's a lot of variability based on, each crop you're trying to spray. But let's say we're just talking about one crop. Apple. We'll say apple. If there's a certain volume and a rate intended for apple, is there a lot of variability from one apple tree to the next? Maybe the morphology, that is the shape and the how big it is, or how much actual crop is within that canopy. Maybe how it's planted. Is it trellised? Is it big individual trees for greenhouses? Are you spraying tables? Are you spraying rows? Are they suspended? Are they in pots? Are they outside? How are they actually positioned? Is, in fact, an acre of mums in one operation the same as an acre of mums in another operation? Well, in North America, our labels reflect planting area. An acre of corn is an acre of corn. In field crops, it's pretty low variability. Soybean is soybean. So this is not a bad way to create a label. But in any three-dimensional crop or a perennial crop, there's so much variability, there could be orders of magnitude. In other words, one rate and one volume probably isn't correct just because it's a certain species. More information is needed. And just to beat this to death, this is a large 3D canopy, to my mind. Citrus, tree nut, sour cherry. These are huge. So how much leaf area do you think is in an acre of these trees? Would it be the same amount of leaf area as a medium canopy, like the semi-dwarf or densified orchard? How about grape? I don't know why I listed this as small. That's me for reference. These are actually really big canopies, but different canopies on different spacing means different amounts of leaves to cover. So a per acre rate may not make sense. And what about the time of year? Look at these 2 blocks, for example. These 2 blocks are both apple tree. Would you spray these the same way? Because the label won't differentiate. How about as the season progresses? Maybe there isn't a whole lot of new growth pre-petal fall. How about post? They change over time too. So the time of year or the stage of development that you spray should factor in. It doesn't appear on a lot of labels. A real simple way to sum all this up is something as easy as just row spacing. Let's say you've got 2 acres of some crop, and one of them is planted 15% closer together than its neighbor. That means per acre, it's got 15% more canopy to protect. But there's no indication of how you might change your rate or your water volume to account for that. And this isn't a new idea. It's why many Australasian countries have already begun basing their rates on a 100-meter row length by 1 meter height. So they're basing their rates and their volumes on how much canopy there is to protect, not on the area it's planted on. Okay, that's a pet peeve of mine. I'll just leave that there. Defining coverage was another aspect of a disconnect between label and what an operator might do. And most of the research trials tend to rely on residue. So you take a surface or a collector and you would rinse it off and see how much product landed. But residue testing kind of masks important information that I think a grower should be thinking about. And here's a good metaphor for that. This is a battleship game for anyone old enough to still play board games. On the left, let's say that's a leaf, and each of those pegs represent a droplet. Now, in this case, there are 10 pegs there, and you've covered about 10% of your target. So if someone came to me and said, hey, I covered 10% of my target, I'd say that was a good spray job. You did a great job. But it doesn't tell me how those droplets are distributed over the target. In A, you only kind of clustered them together in the upper right-hand quadrant of that target. Effectively, you missed 3/4 of it. So even though you covered 10%, I wouldn't say that was great coverage. Certainly not for a contact product anyway. In B, there's the same 10% distributed evenly over the surface. So even though the same surface area got covered, that deposit distribution shows me that the odds of hitting a pest, maybe an insect that doesn't move, a sucking insect or a spore, kind of go up. And C shows us why maybe we do repeated fungicide applications as products break down, photooxidize, or bacteria gobbles them up, or rain washes the residue off. It's good to spray again. So there's still a little residual working, that's the whites. When you come along with your next application, that's the reds. And the odds of one droplet landing on another are actually terribly small. So if your distribution's good, you end up covering more of that leaf surface. So when a label says get good coverage, are we talking about the area covered or the deposit density? Don't know. Both of those things are kind of lost when you do a residue test. You just rinse off the surface and see what's in the rinsate. Only by looking at distribution do you really get a good idea of how a product might work. You can do this yourself. Water-sensitive paper that I mentioned earlier is relatively cheap and available. It's a bit trickier in greenhouses where they're super humid, and since these are water sensitive, the clock is ticking the moment you start putting them up. But even if they begin to turn color of their own accord, there's enough contrast after you spray that you can discern deposits from just kind of an overall changing in the humid environment. And how much is enough? Well, I'll be honest, nobody knows. Unfortunately, labels don't look at this and give us an objective. They just say get good coverage, and growers are left to assume more is better. It's not always the case. But in my experience and my colleagues' experience, and an awful lot of peer-reviewed journal articles, this is a fairly safe estimate for fungicide coverage in hort crops. You can see not enough on the left. You can see likely too much on the right, again, assuming a contact fungicide here. And enough kind of hovers in the middle there. And if you absolutely need a number, we've never seen a problem with 85 drops per square centimeter and 10 to 15% coverage. And even then, if you put 10 of these targets up in a big crop, if you can pull that off on 80% or just 8 of the 10, you're laughing. Spraying is highly variable. The weirdest gust of wind, or you move your hand, or a leaf's in the way, from moment to moment, you could get very different coverage, even in the same pass. So you need a lot of these targets to get a decent average, which is why if you can pull off where it says enough on 80% of your crop, you should be in good shape. Let's carry on here. Maybe you've heard the term the lowest efficacious dose, which is how little can I get away with? That's the minimum amount of active ingredient that must be deposited on a target to get efficacy. So no matter what coverage metric you use, or whatever concentration you use, as long as your application satisfies that critical threshold of this much spread over this much area, you should be successful. But the label, it doesn't tell us. It tells us how much maybe to put in the water, or how much of that spray mix to use per area, or it tells us to use enough water to ensure good coverage. But it really doesn't tell us where the finish line is in this race. Imagine running a marathon and not knowing where it ended. It's silly. And I'm not trying to disparage registrants or a regulatory agency. It is a complicated thing. There's a really tough relationship between the concentration of the product you're using, the droplet size, and the dose. And I'll try to sum that up here in defense of our regulatory agency and our registrants. Let's say we've got a 100-micron droplet on the left. We know, because it's a cubic relationship, that's the same amount of liquid as in 8 50-micron droplets. Now, those little red dots, that's a molecule of active ingredient. And let's say the concentration is such that we've got 8 active molecules in that 100 micron droplet. If we cut that up into 8 pieces and distribute it equally, then we should have the same concentration of active ingredient in those 8 droplets. So for all intents and purposes, even though we have different numbers of droplets, they're all at the same concentration. And then let's land them on a plant. Well, we know from earlier that the big droplet is going to spread more than the small droplets, and I can make some assumptions about that. But what we know for sure is if everything lands, I'm going to cover a lot more surface area with those 8 droplets than I am with that one big one, even though it's the same concentration. And then we let it dry. Well, that big droplet is going to form a pretty thick plaque of residue because there's just so much more product in the smaller area of contact. And it's going to be spread a lot more thinly with those 8 droplets. So which is better? How do we describe that on a label in a way that's actually useful? Maybe we want the product the way it is on the left so we can weather photodegradation and bacteria gobbling it up and rain. Maybe we want that residue to remain intact as long as possible. Or maybe we don't because of post-harvest intervals and exposure and residue testing leading to when you can harvest. Maybe we want it to kind of kill the pest and be gone as soon as possible. That's on the right. And I haven't even touched on the coolest bit, which is how are you actually spraying? Not just what size droplet, not just the concentration or how much is enough, but how'd you actually get it there? I should explain before I run off. Those are all air blast sprayers. And if I were talking to an operator and explaining their optimal and best use, their safest use, what I would tell the person in the top left would be fundamentally different from what I would tell the person in the bottom right. These pieces of equipment simply operate in different ways. They're manufactured to do different things. And you have to know how they work to get the outcome you're looking for. Something as simple as just boom height or distance from nozzle to target can have big implications. We put some rhodamine dye into a 3-nozzle boom and walked along in the snow, which is our privilege here in Canada, spraying in the cold. We actually had to use antifreeze windshield wiper fluid to stop it from firing icicles everywhere, but we got it to work. On the left, that is an optimal boom height. It's at just the right height that all 3 nozzles overlapped, just the right amount, and you got nice even coverage. Bit of wind going from left to right, you can see it streaking a bit. If we get too close, each of those nozzles concentrate their product on one spot, so you get over and under dosing. If we hold it too far away, well, the deposits are really weird. The droplets don't actually make it to the ground in time for the wind to whip them away, and you get uneven coverage and high drift. This is a matter of just a few feet's difference. A few feet difference. So imagine in a greenhouse or your operation that even if you had the perfect label and you were inefficient or inconsistent with how you sprayed, look at the differences that can occur. As for the crop itself, we have to think about that consistency in a slightly different way. Let's say on this dose response curve, we've got a pest population. It's over there on the y-axis, up and down. There's your percent pest. Let's say we've got 100% pests at the top of that curve, which is bad news. And by applying some product, there's a dose response curve. That's on the x-axis. The more product you put in place, the more you're going to knock that pest population out. You'll never get to 0, but that's just a generic kind of curve. And now let's put, I don't know, blackberry bush in there. If you spray inconsistently in your crop, what you're hoping for is that it gets evenly covered so all parts of those surfaces get the same dose. And if you do that right, your lowest efficacious rate, you might get 3% of your pest left. That's a good spray day. But in reality, you hit here and you drench there and you miss here, and you hit there and you drench there and you miss there. A big complex canopy doesn't get consistent, even spraying. At least it's hard to do. So if I take the average coverage, maybe it falls a little higher up the curve. So even though you sprayed a dose that you thought made sense and you followed the label, because you got inconsistent, non-uniform coverage, all those misses add up. And overall, you might end up with 9% of your pest kicking around, even though you sprayed the same as the other person who got more consistent coverage. Got to move my little bubble here so I can read my own words. So coverage variability leads to misses or, worse sublethal doses. If you keep missing the same spot over and over, maybe you would start to increase the odds of resistance. But by improving your uniformity, we'll say, by getting a higher average dose, which is here, you can see there's far fewer misses, you just kind of push it back down the curve again. So with less misses, your overall coverage goes up and your efficacious dose improves, if you see what I mean. So spraying without looking to see where your spray is going, you'd be shooting yourself in the foot. Okay, let me kind of bring it all home with two examples of how all these different little things could alter what a label says and how a product is registered versus what you do. I'll give you a little example and a big one. Here's a little example. This is a pressure gauge. And on the top of a pressure gauge, most of them, is a rubber vent plug. And it's unfortunately called a nipple. We're just going to get over that. We're all grown-ups. There it is. That's the gauge's nipple. And if you ever read a new gauge, it says, cut the nipple off or pull that plug. It's a vent, you see. What it does is it lets the liquid on the inside of the gauge equilibrate pressure and temperature with its outside world. If you don't pull that plug, you can increase the pressure inside as it heats up. And that affects how the needle moves. In other words, a plugged gauge may not be accurate. So I had a student who found himself with a little too much time. He should never have told me that. And I had him start throwing gauges in hot and cold water and figure out whether or not we need to cut that nipple off or not, or if it was just something the manufacturer put on there to make us nervous. So this is what that student did. There is the average precision of an unvented gauge. He did it at 3 temperatures, 15 at, what were the 3 temperatures? 15 degrees Celsius, 30, and heaven help you, 45 degrees Celsius. But that was meant to emulate what if you left one of these in a truck before testing. As a registrant or as someone testing products, you go off for lunch and you leave your equipment in a truck, it heats up. So if it was unvented, you can see at 15, 30 and PSI, there is a difference in how that needle moves. But honestly, a few PSI off, 1.5, 2 or 3, who cares? That doesn't seem like it would make a huge difference. Then we started looking at it a little differently. And we thought, all right, what does 2 or 3 degree PSI mean during small plot testing? So we laid this out. If somebody was walking 3.1 kilometers an hour, ooh, my hour fell off, and they were spraying 5 gallons an acre from a standard 8002 nozzle. This is a fairly classic situation for small plot research. You put everything in a pop bottle, you walk at a walking pace, and you spray. And let's say you start in the morning, truck's cold, and you're off, maybe you put 1% more on than you intended because of how the gauge responds. And then after lunch in a hot truck, you end up spraying about 0.5% less than you intended. Because this is small plots and highly accurate, that span of 1.5% actually represents about a gallon an acre difference. That's 20%. Because it's such a small plot, because you're spraying such small volumes, a very small change translates to a very big impact. That really knocked us out. So anyone who's doing small plot research and has a pressure gauge, yeah, vent it. Now, on a larger scale, does it really matter? So here's a random selection of 150 minor use labels expansions that I got from a former colleague. These are all the products in Canada and the US that we could find over about I think a 20-year period. And all I did was add up how many were based on air blast work or hand boom work or handgun or mist blower or over the row. In other words, what kind of equipment did the researcher use to test their products, which eventually inform the label? And what crops were they working in? Grape, tender fruit. So here it is. You can see it's fairly even across the board. A researcher was as likely to use an air blast sprayer to test a product as they were a handgun. Well, these pieces of equipment work very, very differently. For example, a hand boom, a very popular piece of research equipment, it relies on hydraulic pressure to fire droplets into a canopy. They don't move terribly fast for terribly long. They just drift all over the place. This is why we use air assist on sprayers to get into big canopies. Spray doesn't travel as far or penetrate as deeply without that air. So we tested them. We tested them. What's the difference between spraying from a hand boom or an air blast? We did it in blueberry, apple, and grape. We calibrated the hand boom to put out the same volume as the air blast sprayer. I think we use Pristine or Captain. Yeah, we use Pristine or Captan as a real world example. And those are typical of 500 or 1,000 liters per hectare. There's the equipment, the hand boom and the air blast sprayer. And we threw water sensitive paper all over these 3 different crops. And here was the result. In this busy slide on the left-hand side, this is the number of drops per square centimeter. Remember, we can look at coverage different ways. On the left is deposit density, on the right is area covered. Now for apple, bottom left, you can see that the hand boom at 1,000 liters put down about 80 drops per square centimeter. I'm sorry, 90. But with the air blast sprayer, it almost doubled it. We got twice the number of hits just by changing the piece of equipment we used to spray with. And that theme was consistent across all crops. In fact, in blueberry, we ended up dropping like 5 times as many droplets that we determined that landed. And if that's not your cup of tea and you're not convinced that droplet density matters, then we'll go ahead, look at percent coverage. In apple, we covered twice the area just by using an air assist sprayer. In blueberry, like 3 times or more. And the reason there are 3 bars in grape is because while we only covered so much with a hand boom, we absolutely saturated it with an air blast sprayer. So much so that we didn't know how much more coverage we were actually getting because wet is wet. So we had to back off the volume we were spraying until we could bring it back into range again. A lot more spray landed in a grape is kind of the take home here. So, I didn't want to just cause trouble. I wasn't going to go to registrants or small plot researchers and say, hey, stop using hand booms and start filling huge air blast sprayers to do all your plot testing. It can't be done. Logistically, you can't use that many reps and that many volumes and that many doses and fill an entire air blast sprayer just to spray one tree, especially with the 2x, 1x, 1/2 and control thing we talked about earlier. So, you can use research-based plot sprayers like this. It's an air blast sprayer that has multiple tanks on it. That helps. But I think this is better. This satisfies the requirement of emulating an air blast sprayer by using small volumes, and you can spray multiple crops. This is a backpack mist blower. So when we used it, to put my money where my mouth is, we got a much closer relationship between what an air blast sprayer can do and what the backpack did. Now, admittedly, on the left, you can see the backpack created a lot more droplets, but it's a mist blower. It makes a mist. An air blast sprayer doesn't tend to make droplets that small. On the right, where we just looked at the area covered, they were much, much closer, certainly within standard error. So, this is a practical way for registrants to research labels intended for air blast sprayers and, use them in such a way that it's relevant to what the end user can do. And here are the practical implications of this very long rant. I think label rates should be high enough to ensure effective, consistent, and sustainable results while accommodating the diverse crops that you spray in weather conditions that you might be spraying in, for a number of sprayer designs and a number of application methods for operators that have different abilities. Holy cow. It's no wonder labels are a bit generic and light on information, because look what they have to do. And that is what they do. So if you know all that as an operator, you can perhaps take advantage of all that latitude. If you pay more attention to the droplet size you're using, the method that you're using, the consistency in which you're achieving coverage, using water-sensitive paper and recognizing how droplets and the crop react to that spray, maybe you could take advantage of that built-in redundancy. Maybe you don't need all that water volume. Maybe you do. Maybe you don't need all that product. Maybe you do. It's a dangerous thing that we're treading on here. But the trick here is precision. If you've got twice the canopy in 1 acre as you do in the other, it simply doesn't make sense to use the same amount of water and pesticide. We can agree on that. Where to draw the line and where you start flirting with disaster is another question. And the more informed you are, and the more you understand the information that goes into making these labels, the more precise and rational you can be. So what is a perfect label? I think a perfect label would have the lowest effective concentration. That gives us our residual. In other words, put this much product in this much water. I think there should be a picture of a piece of water sensitive paper there. Make your coverage look like this, at least this. That's your threshold. And this is where in your crop it should look like that. So there's your finish line in the race. I think it's got to have a maximum rate. I mean, we can't go around spraying more pesticide that's on a label ever, ever, ever. Please don't ever do that. That's human safety, environmental safety, toxicology, lots of ologies. Don't do it. But recognizing what the goal is would empower operators to select the safest and most appropriate strategy for their equipment and their skill level and their conditions. And we do it, by the way. We do it already. This is crop adapted spraying. It's not my idea. I gently lifted it off of people much more clever than me from all around the world, and I twisted it to our evil ends. So in Ontario, we've promoted for years spraying to the size of the target. And this slide will show you just what I mean. We've got 3 orchards, large, medium, and small, and we have the same concentration, in this case, 1,000 liters per hectare or 100 gallons sprayed per acre. That's what the label says. And we just mix that with so much chemistry to so much water. Now, as far as the tree's concerned on the left, let's say we spray and we land those 6 droplets there. Each of those droplets give the same coverage and have the same concentration as the tree on the middle, the medium. That leaf looks exactly the same coverage, product at the same concentration. And then the small orchard, same coverage, product at the same concentration. Those 3 leaves, it doesn't matter which tree they're from, they all got the same control. What changed? How much spray mix was released per acre, because there simply wasn't enough tree there. As far as those trees are concerned, you're going to get the same level of control. But using the amount of product per planted acre, that changed drastically. So are you off label? Yes and no. But I don't think I'm going to see this in my lifetime. That kind of label would take forever to write and to justify. And there's a lot of time and money involved in making labels that way, and a lot of liability that maybe some people don't want. So for now, I think it's important for the next generation of researchers and those of us using those products to recognize these disconnects. And when you're assessing a fungicide, keep as many of those variables in mind as possible and try to use them in such a way as is consistent with a standard grower's practice. The more variables we keep the same, the more likely what a registrant or a researcher sees is what you as an operator will see. Be transparent with the method you used. Even if you can't do what a grower does, a label should say what was done so a grower can make intuitive moves to try to be successful. And consider these things when considering fungicide performance and residue. If we're all on the same page, I'd like to think that we'll all enjoy more success. So that's the end. Thank you for your time. I hope this didn't go longer than you intended. The subject's kind of near and dear to my heart, so I do tend to ramble on. I'll take any questions.
Jason, that's great. Thank you so much. You've given us a ton of food for thought. So I'm going to turn it over now to Kara McCreary, who's our greenhouse veg IPM specialist. So the me of veggies. And she's going to ask some of the questions. I see some people are raising your hands, but it's just easier if you put it in the chat function for us. So go ahead and do that. And you are also able to upvote questions if it's one you're particularly interested in. Okay, Kara?
All right. Thanks, Jason. That was great. It's always a pleasure listening to your advice and information that you're sharing. So thanks so much for coming out to talk about this. So we do have a few questions. I'll start with one. We know how wetting agents work with hydronic wet sprays. Do they work in auto fogs? Are there drawbacks or dangers?
I'm going to try my best with this. I haven't done it, and I do know some people that have. And if somebody from DRAM was here, I know what they would say. DRAM is a manufacturer of a lot of greenhouse equipment. If you have a wetting agent, it's going to reduce it's going to change the viscosity of what you're spraying. It's going to make it thinner. Imagine alcohol versus honey. So droplets are going to be smaller when they're produced, and when they hit, they're going to run more readily. If you put that in an autofogger, there is the potential that they're going to get too small. And I think there may be some caustic concerns based on what those spreaders are. I know brass is a bad idea in those systems because it's highly concentrated. It gets gobbled up real quick by the chemistry. I'm going to say this. Please don't experiment with any of the topics we've talked about here willy-nilly. In my experience, when you have a question like this, the best approach is to go to the registrant and say, you don't have an adjuvant on this label, and I want to apply it using this methodology. Do you have any reason I shouldn't do that? Like, why isn't it already on the label? And either they're going to say, we just never tested it, or we found that this caused a problem. So it would be rather cavalier of me to say, run out and just forget labels and do whatever you want. I hope that's not what you took away from this. People like DRAM and all the registrants I've worked with are very willing to test these different usage patterns in a controlled situation because the registrant wants to see you succeed. They sure don't want to burn your crop. And if they can find a different usage pattern that isn't on the label, they will work with you to determine whether or not it's something you can do. So I'm really hesitant to say, yeah, go ahead and dump a spreader in a fogger and you should be good to go. I can't say that because I don't know. I do know that there is a chance for phytotoxicity. There is a chance that maybe the product will be taken up differently by the plant, or it maybe will produce droplets that don't behave the way you expect. And we will either stick all over something or never arrive. Test it and have a third party there to test it with you and formalize the label change for the next person that has that question. Sorry, that's a bit evasive, but I thought it was important that I put that caveat in.
Thanks, Jason. Another question, does temperature and humidity change coverage and efficacy?
Oh my goodness, yes. Oh my goodness, yes. I'll give you a great example of this, and I apologize if you're not in a glass house where humidity is. I'm a great sweater. I can't even go in there for 2 minutes without just sweating buckets. I did research in an orchard a long time ago, and we sprayed onto water-sensitive paper and got whatever coverage we got. And we retrieved those papers, and by the time we were ready to go put another application, the sky was going to open up, and it was really, really humid out, and we just said, let's just call it. And it was a wicked cloudburst, and it was gone within an hour. And since we'd already kind of committed the day and it was suddenly weirdly bright and dry and sunny out, we said, well, let's keep going. So I put water sensitive papers back in exactly the same spots in the same orientation, and we sprayed precisely the same way. And you would not believe the difference in the coverage. In a humid situation, droplets do not evaporate, and they will stay intact longer and on course longer and remain as droplets longer on a plant, enabling them to spread, to run, to change how they deposit. In dry situations, dry and windy particularly, a lot of droplets will simply never arrive, or they'll evaporate and shrink to the point that they start to behave very, very differently. You may have sprayed a medium, but by the time it got there, it was a fine. So it's now super concentrated and moving weirdly. And in some cases, it may land as a completely dried dust mote and not be biologically active and require, dew or some other environmental condition or irrigation, for example, to reactivate. So the conditions that you spray in, the environmental conditions, do have a massive impact on not only the coverage that you're going to achieve, but the biological result of that droplet once it arrives, which is why when we run these experiments, we always take great pains to monitor weather conditions and suggest conditions that are conducive to success. Some products like it hot and dry. Some products don't. And if it matters, truly matters, that is something that you'll find on the label.
Thanks, Jason. Another question, would you recommend, or what would you recommend on very waxy leaves? Would you say
Prayer.
misting,
No.
misting with or without spreader or sticker?
No, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. If your product is registered for that crop, then whoever's selling it knows it's a waxy leaf. Cabbage, you say? I think all cabbages are waxy. So if the product is registered for that crop, then they know what that surface area is going to be like. As such, a certain amount of sticker or spreader will already be in the jug. Now, I'm always a little cautious about telling people to throw adjuvants in. Very much like the first question, it can react in funny ways. On the other hand, just because I'm government, I like to sit right in the middle of the line. If you have a product that's formulated for 50 different hort crops, and some are waxy and some aren't, then on that extreme spectrum, you've either got too much spreader or sticker for one and not enough for another. So if you're spraying a crop and you know it's particularly waxy and hard to wet, maybe a vertical leaf or a fruit surface, and you see that no matter what you do, you're getting a lot of runoff, and please do observe your coverage, I don't see any harm as long as it's not, expressly prohibited by the label. How's that for a big afternoon word? To add an additional amount of sticker. Once again, I beg of you, don't just willy-nilly spray a whole greenhouse with an ounce of magic goo in there. Don't do it. Take a small area and recognize that this is a test and monitor what happens. If you like what you see and there are no problems and you see improvement, talk to Kara, talk to Sarah, talk to your registrant, get another set of eyes in there, and then expand the practice. And if it's truly worthy, the registrants may make that change on the label. So again, the next person doesn't have to learn the hard way. I have advised people not to add adjuvants just because someone said you should, but to always do a test and roll it up when you're happy with the results. And I won't say any different to you. I think there is room for additional adjuvants. I would just kind of take those shiny brochures with a grain of salt and see for yourself.
Thanks, Jason. So you did actually touch on some questions that I've had frequently from vegetable growers. But I guess maybe I'm wondering if you could reiterate something a little bit for me and whoever's on the call here. So with our vine crops, specifically those that we grow vertically, we have a lot of challenges with labels based on age of the crop. So if you can imagine, a pepper seedling that's like a foot tall and whatever, 8 weeks old or something, compared to a 10-month-old, 10-foot tall pepper plant. When we have a label that restricts not only like the rate of the active ingredient per hectare, but also the water volume, a 8-week-old pepper seedling could drown in the same volume that barely gets enough coverage on a 10-month-old pepper plant, right? So there's very few labels that sort of break it out into young, medium-sized, and large plants.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm hearing from you is really like investigating the coverage and sort of focusing on getting the right amount of product on those plants.
I hear you. Let's take a step back.
Okay.
Wouldn't it be lovely if a product was only intended to be sprayed on a plant at a certain stage of development, because maybe that's when that particular pest is there. So if you're at flower and you're worried about disease, well, we can assume the plant is of a certain size and age when it's at flower, and then we can make an assumption on the morphology or the shape of that plant. We can't talk about planting architecture. We don't know if they're all packed together or stacked up or hung, but at least we can assume the plant's of a certain stage of development, which would mean that how the product was tested should pretty much correlate with what you as a grower are trying to do. What you're describing is a very big change in the physiology of the plant based on its age. Hops, by the way, is a great example in this. Hops will literally grow a foot a day. It's amazing. It's like my son who's 12. He just goes to bed that big and wakes up that big. That ain't the same kid. And he takes more food. So a good label would recognize if a product has to be applied at such a diverse range of developmental stages that the physiology would be just so different from week to week. And I would hope provide a concentration. Put this much product in this much water, spray until you get good coverage, never exceed this much per times per year or volume of glass house or weirdly planted area. There has to be some hard stop at the end for safety. But if you get none of that, and you don't know what stage of development that product was tested, you're left with assumptions. So the first thing you have to assume is that the product was probably tested in a volume of water that is typical of the operation. I don't know what that is, by the way. Maybe it's 500 liters per acre because everyone does it. I'm sorry, liters per hectare, 50 gallons an acre, or 100, whatever. And then you have to assume, and by the way, assume is a dangerous word here, people, but this is kind of what you're left with. You assume this much product in this much water. How much of that as a whole do I need to achieve coverage? So if the plant's this big, only spray enough of that until you've achieved coverage. And if you have a lot left in the tank, you didn't need it. Now we do this in orchards all the time with what's called a recycling sprayer. These sprayers have a big tank of spray mix, and they're vertical booms straight up and down, and they spray sideways. On the other side of that boom is a shroud. So the liquid sprays into the crop, and whatever misses and blows through is captured by these shrouds and then recirculated back to the tank. So what it does is it picks up its own waste. You just spray, and whatever you didn't need, you're just going to automatically recollect. So at the end of an acre or a hectare, even though you put enough volume and spray to cover that acre or a hectare, you may have 20, 30, 50% of it left over. Well, guess what? You're off label. You only sprayed half. And you say, no, I didn't. I released everything the label said per acre. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So to go back to your question, Kara, if you can mix the right concentration, and that's the assumption, is actually how much product to liquid do I need? My suggestion is go to the worst case scenario. When that crop was at its absolute maximum size, you mix the maximum amount of product in the water required to get coverage from that, and then you step backwards. When the crop's this big, maybe you only need that much you only need a reflected amount of how much product and water. Now, one word to the wise. If you have a crop that's 1/10 as big as it could be, do not assume you're going to use 1/10 of the spray mix. There's something called catchment. A very small crop is very hard to hit, okay? So if it took 10 drops to hit a big plant, you can't assume 1 drop will hit a small plant. It actually tends to take more liquid and spray to achieve coverage in a smaller crop because it's just not good at catching it. And it's kind of hard to miss a big crop. So I would not assume a linear response here. That crop's twice as big, gonna need twice the product. Nope. The only way to know for sure is to go out with just water and water-sensitive paper, no product, and get a sense of how much is needed for your environment and your method, and then work out the math. And I'm really risking a lot by saying that to, I don't know, 140 people here who I don't know. I'm willing to have this conversation one-on-one with people based on their ability and their understanding. But if someone here is just looking for the quick answer and said, that dude told me to spray half, you may get what's coming to you. It does take some research. You do want to bring in some specialists, but I don't think it makes sense to spray the same volume and chemistry on a plant that's 10 times as big now as it was then. It just doesn't make sense.
Thanks, Jason. Another question here, should greenhouses always spray with fans off to make sure the spray is going where you want it to?
Yes and no. Who works for the government? If you're spraying very fine droplets, we've learned that they'll stay aloft forever. And it's kind of like throwing a feather through pudding. I don't care how hard you fired it, it has no mass and no momentum. So once it's in the air, gravity very slowly will pull it, but the only other force you have at your control are your fans. So believe it or not, sometimes if you're called out to a greenhouse and I'm getting crummy coverage over in this corner, or I can never seem to hit here, or why do I always have disease here? It may not be your spraying, it may actually be your circulation. So I've seen people take smoke bombs. Kara wouldn't let me do it in the Ag Canada greenhouse, but maybe that wasn't her fault. Maybe she's just too cautious. I don't know. But a simple paintball smoke bomb will show you, and it's super fun, by the way, will show you where the air currents are going. And if you see spots where your air is just stalled out, then how would you expect a droplet to get in there? It's not going to do it. So calibrating the currents in your greenhouse is a super way to carry very fine droplets to their targets. On the other hand, it's also a super way to blow them off course. So the two things work together. I would not automatically shut off the fans in a greenhouse when I'm spraying, particularly if I'm relying on them for circulation. But if you're venting, you're just sucking all that out into the atmosphere, and that's not doing you any good either. I hope that's not what you meant. I say that the air in a greenhouse works in tandem with your application method. Where you release the spray in a Quonset hut or in the greenhouse, relative to how the air is circulating and the droplet size, don't ever consider any of those in isolation. Consider them as a whole. And, go buy some smoke bombs. They're just great fun.
Make sure you invite Jason. Okay, so there's been a lot of comments thanking you and appreciating your great talk here. So thank you for that. Another comment question is that a lot of things that are not identified on the label has to do with the pH range optimal for the product. So any comments on that?
Yeah, it can be frustrating. If there's a pH issue and the registrant knows about it, it may be because it destroys the efficacy of the product over a certain amount of time. I'm aware of some fungicides where if you're at pH 8, you got 8 minutes, before this stuff is just dead in the tank. And in extreme cases like that, I think you can rest assured that if there's a serious pH reaction, then the registrant's going to let you know. And, just people in practice will notice very quickly, why did your product work and why didn't mine? Oh, it was water quality. So, I'm less bent out of shape about water quality issues. I would like to know more about rain fastness, just to throw my own little problem out there. How well can we expect a product to offer residual activity after overhead irrigation or something like that? I wish that were on a label. But I haven't found in my experience that if there's a significant water quality issue, colloids or something suspended in the water, or some particular water quality chemistry issue, if that truly affects performance, generally you're going to hear about it. Maybe you have a different experience. If you do, by all means, share it with me. And let me take the opportunity to say that I run a website with a colleague, Dr. Tom Wolf, called www.sprayers101.com, Sprayers 101. We've got hundreds of articles and videos and downloadables on there. If all of this went by way too fast, I don't blame you if it did. Or if you have questions that I haven't answered well, go onto the website, type in a keyword, and I promise you a very boring evening reading lots of articles or watching a few videos. We have a lot of answers there for you once after this talk is done that you can go fill your boots with good sprayer information.
Yeah, and with that, we should probably wrap this up soon, but I did want to reiterate, if anyone does want to rewatch this talk or show it to their spray applicator, this will be up on the floriculture.com blog under recorded webinars. We also have a YouTube page, so on Floriculture YouTube is our handle, I think. And Kara, on the greenhouse veg side, where can your growers find more information?
Yeah, so it will also be up on the ongreenhousevegetables.ca blog, and we'll link to the same YouTube channel that Sarah's got. So
excellent. Well, with that, I want to thank Jason so much for such a great presentation, great visuals. Yeah, again, lots of comments that everyone was thrilled to hear this topic, and you explained it really well. And thanks for joining us, and everyone have a wonderful Thursday afternoon and a good weekend.
Thanks for having me. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.